Thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to be here to share some insights into harnessing the power of technology to help rebuild an equitable economy, and specifically how businesses and nonprofits and governments can work together to address the COVID-19 crisis. I want to start by thanking the Korea Development Bank and the Korea International Trade Association for creating the space to have these important conversations. And it's especially meaningful for me to be here today, as this is actually the first conference I've been to in person and the first international trip I've taken since the start of COVID. So it feels like some progress. But my name is Jen Carter. I am the Global Head of Technology at Google.org, which is Google's philanthropic arm. And I've been at Google for well over a decade now and work to connect Google volunteers with high-impact technology-driven nonprofits around the world. The pandemic has led to so much loss of lives, of jobs, of time in school. Grappling with this loss is challenging and takes its toll, but it's events like this where we can come together and talk about solutions that leave me optimistic. There is a lot of work to be done, though. The pandemic has acted as an accelerant of global inequality. It has exacerbated existing inequities in health, in education, in employment, and in the digital divide, which means it's disproportionately impacting already marginalized and vulnerable groups, including women and minorities and rural workers and daily wage earners and many others. Looking back on 2020, the data is jarring. 81 million people lost their jobs across the Asia-Pacific region, and another 25 million are at risk of seeing their incomes drop to poverty levels, and these numbers mirror the global trends as well. At the same time, in Korea, which has maintained its status as one of the top performing OECD nations, even then there was still a drop in the economy. As we look forward towards recovery, it's really important that we ask not only how can we get people back into jobs, but also more importantly, how can we create and connect people to jobs that pay a living wage. But before I dive in more, I wanted to take a step back and share a little bit of background on Google.org. So Google.org is Google's philanthropic arm, and we bring the best of Google to innovative nonprofits and civic entities who are tackling the world's toughest challenges. And we do that in a few ways. First, by providing our grant dollars, so 1% of Google's profits go to support nonprofits around the world. We also do that by providing our products and technology. So, for example, installing Wi-Fi immediately during or after a crisis. And finally, we do that by providing what we think is our most valuable resource, which is our people, Googlers who volunteer their time and expertise to help nonprofits on the ground. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we contributed over $100 million to support nonprofits around the world, and Googlers rolled up their sleeves to deliver over 100,000 pro bono hours to nonprofits to help with some of the impacts of the pandemic. So we did that in a number of different ways. Sorry, there we go. So we did that in a number of different ways. But for example, we did a lot of work in the health and humanitarian response space. And so there were a lot of nonprofits and universities and other academic institutions that were using AI or data analytics to understand the pandemic and its effects on vulnerable populations. And so we created a $8.5 million grant fund and delivered that funding to 31 organizations globally that were tracking the spread and the impact of the disease. And that funding was really in a few key categories. So the first was around monitoring and forecasting the spread of the disease. The second was around improving health equity and understanding the secondary impacts of the pandemic. The third was around slowing the transmission, and in particular, thinking about how we can help with contact tracing and other similar efforts. And the final category was around supporting healthcare workers as they supported the rest of society. So for an example, in this first category of monitoring and forecasting the spread of the disease, we always try to start with a problem statement. And so the problem here was we needed to understand and predict the spread of the disease in order to empower key decision makers. And so we worked with an organization called global.health, which was actually a consortium of researchers from Harvard and Boston Children's Hospital and Oxford and a number of other universities. We gave them both grant funding as well as a team of Googlers who worked full-time with them for 6 months, helping to build this health equity tracker that could track individual case-level data so that researchers and public health officials could use that to predict the spread. But rather than me continuing to talk about it, I would love to share a video that looks like it may have gotten skipped from this presentation. Let's see. All right, well, we will skip that video unless the folks can help pull it up. No? Do you all have a different copy of the presentation? I think there might be a couple of videos missing. All right, well, if not, we can, oh, there we go. Thank you so much.
자주 보이죠? 떠다니는 부자 같은 걸 그러니까 조업할 때 금은에 의해서 완.
Sorry, it is a different
정말요.
video.
어떻게 보면 전혀 뭐
It's about global.health, if you have that one. Well, I will share those after then. But so in addition to global.health, we also did work, as I mentioned, in terms of supporting healthcare workers. And so this was actually a local collaboration with Doctors on the Cloud, which is a nonprofit that's affiliated with Yonsei University. And again, if we start with the problem statement here, they were trying to better predict hospitalization and intensive care needs due to COVID-19. And so we worked with them to create and scale a decision support system for patients. And so what does that actually mean? So there were really two components to the work that they did. The first was creating two different apps, one for patients and one for physicians. So the patients could track their symptoms and the physicians could see what the patients were experiencing. But then on top of those apps, they also built an AI solution that enabled them to better predict hospitalizations so that hospitals and other facilities could plan ahead. So another example in the economic opportunity space was with an organization called YBI, or Youth Business International. So they're comprised of helping small and medium businesses, which are really the backbone of the global economy, but they've been devastated by the COVID-19 crisis. And so that really was the problem statement that we were trying to solve. And we did that by funding YBI and providing them with a $5 million grant that went to support their relief and recovery fund. And they, in turn, partnered with a number of different organizations across Europe and the Middle East and Africa and Asia Pacific. And so right here in Korea, their partner was the Korea Startup Forum, and they worked with them to support particularly vulnerable business owners, including women and young adults and refugees and others who are particularly vulnerable. One more organization in this space was Root Impact. So again, the problem statement here is that the youth unemployment rate is 9.7%, and COVID only made that worse. But at the same time, SMEs were still finding it difficult to find talent. And so that really means you have a little bit of a skills mismatch. And so what Root Impact is doing is they're actually helping teach skills. And so we gave them a $1 million grant to start an impact campus. And during that, the folks who participate are going to learn a bunch of digital skills. They're also going to get support from a number of Google employees who will mentor them as volunteers. And then finally, they'll be connected to Google for Startups organizations. So in addition to working with external nonprofits and for-good orgs, we also have an in-house one-stop shop called Grow with Google that really provides all of these digital skills resources that students and job seekers and SMBs need. And then we also have Google for Startups, which really brings the best of Google to help startups accelerate their mission. So I won't read through all of the text on this slide, but as you can see, Grow with Google in Korea has a number of different programs and offerings targeting each of these different groups. And the number I really want to highlight here is that it's served over 50 million people throughout Asia Pacific who have actually received some training via Grow with Google since 2015. So some really impressive numbers there. And then to go into detail on Google for Startups, again, I won't read through all of this, but you can see they also offer a number of different solutions to help startups accelerate their growth. So we covered health and humanitarian response, and then we shifted into economic relief and recovery. And the final category that I wanted to talk about was distance learning. And so one of the problem statements in this space is that parental involvement at home and at school has been shown to be critical to the success of students, and yet parents often face barriers, whether that's economic or educational, cultural or language barriers that prohibit them from being able to communicate with teachers and be involved in their students' school lives. And so even prior to the pandemic, we'd been working with an organization called Talking Points. We provided them with a team of Googlers who worked full-time with them for 6 months to help develop an app that would enable this two-way translated communication between parents and teachers. So that sort of solves the language barrier, but that still leaves some of the cultural and other barriers. And so in addition to just facilitating those conversations, it also offers nudges and personalized content for both the families and the teachers. So for example, it might nudge a parent to ask the teacher about the recent homework assignment, or maybe about test results or something like that. And then of course, when the pandemic hit, this work became even more critical as students shifted to working remotely, and usage really skyrocketed. But the infrastructure that they built was flexible enough that it was able to quickly adapt and offer nudges, for example, related to distance learning and COVID-19. So I've shared a lot about sort of what we do, again, responding to COVID, a lot of work in the health and humanitarian space, in the economic relief and recovery space, and in the distance learning space. And I've also shared a little bit about sort of how we do that. by providing our grant funding and our products and technology as well as our people. But I really wanted to deep dive into the people component, our volunteers, as this is really the critical part to how businesses and nonprofits and governments can work together, and the way that we sort of think about this is a little bit unique to Google. There is another video that I would love to share after, but in the meantime, if you could play this video, I think it just helps bring to life what one of these volunteer engagements could look like in practice.
참 심각해요. 자주 보이죠. 떠다니는 부자 같은 걸 조업할 때 금은에 의해서 많이 올라오고 있어요. 정말 많아. 어떻게 보면 전혀 거시가 안 되고 있어요.
저희가 사람을 투입을 해서 이 부자가 얼마가 있는지를 보려면 시간이 굉장히 많이 들고 사람도 많이 필요하거든요. 가능하면 손쉽게 이 검정색 부자 문제에 대해서 확정할 수 있는 방법이 있을까 저희들이 늘 고민을 해왔었습니다.
해양 생태계나 이런 쪽에 관심이 좀 개인적으로 있었고요. 우연한 계기에 오션이라는 단체를 알게 됐습니다. 연구 중심적인 단체여서 더 관심을 가지게 되었습니다. 좋은 일을 하시는 것 같아서 응원 차원에서 메일을 보내드리게 됐었습니다.
너무 반갑고 너무 놀라웠어요. 제가 처음에 홍준성님으로부터 이메일을 받았을 때는 구글코리아 같은 큰 회사에 계시는 분들이 저희와 어떤 관심을 가지신다고 하셔가지고 너무 기뻤고요.
머신러닝 기법 중에 이제 오토ML이라고 하는 기법이 있는데요. 실제 사진 안에 있는 어떤 특정 형태 패턴을 가진 물체들을 인식을 하고 그것의 개수들을 매저할 수가 있습니다. 그와 같은 기법을 활용해서 도움이 될 수 있을 것이라고 생각을 했습니다.
하나하나 저희가 머릿속에 생각했던 것들이 이제 가시적으로 나타나는 거예요. 그래서 저희 팀 모두 예스! 와우! 이러면서 아주 가치 있는 분들이 전부 그런 마음으로 임해왔습니다.
먼저 유저가 앱을 사용해서 사진을 찍으면 그 부자들을 텐서플로우 라이트를 사용해서 어디에 부자가 몇 개나 찍혀 있는지를 표현을 해주게 됩니다.
찍힌 사진들에서 저희가 원래 얻고자 했던 그런 오브젝트들 관련된 정보를 파이어베이스 데이터베이스에 저장을 한 뒤에 다시 시각적으로 구글맵에 오버레이 시켜서 화면을 구성하는 시스템을 만들었습니다.
새로 개발된 이 앱을 이용하면 누구라도 이미지를 생산을 해낼 수가 있기 때문에 감정 부자의 양을 수작업으로 했을 때에 비해서 한 10분의 1 정도 노력으로 축소시킬 수가 있을 것 같습니다.
아직은 구상 단계에 있긴 하지만 드론을 통해서 데이터를 수집하는 것도 고려해보고 있습니다.
좋은 환경을 물려주는 것은 저희가 반드시 해야 되는 일이고요. 환경을 더 잘 지킬 수 있기 위해서 저희의 기술과 지식도 다음 세대에 잘 물려줘야 하겠습니다.
제 꿈은 시민과학인데요. 일반 시민들이 과학적인 데이터 생산에도 참여를 하고 그 결과를 분석해서 시민들을 위해서 사용하는 것입니다. 구글의 기술로 현실로 만들어내고 꿈을 이루어 나가는 것 같습니다.
Great. So hopefully some Korean speakers in the audience. But while this story was pretty incredible, it really wasn't unique. So we were consistently hearing from nonprofits that they wanted to do more with technology, but they found it difficult to find and retain the software engineers and the product managers and the user experience researchers and designers and everyone else that companies like Google rely on every day to build great products. And we were also hearing consistently from our employees that they wanted to do more to help out in the communities where they lived and worked, but found it difficult to identify pro bono opportunities where they could really use their skills. And so in this case, it worked out because Justin sent a random email to the organization, but we wanted to make this sort of more common. And so we created the Google.org Fellowship, which is a program that enables Googlers to spend full time for 6 months working pro bono with a nonprofit or a civic entity in order to help them really achieve their mission. And so since 2019, we've completed over 25 of these fellowships, and you'll recognize a couple of the names there from earlier in the talk, but we sent a team of Googlers to global.health to track the spread of the disease, and we also had a team with Talking Points that was creating that two-way translated communication between parents and teachers. But I want to walk you through one more example of a fellowship that I'm then going to use to sort of shift into not just what we do, but why we do it that way and how we structure our volunteering engagements to ensure lasting impact in these collaborations between businesses and nonprofits and governments. And so the case study here, the problem statement was in India, 55% of people are dependent on farming for their income, but every year, nearly 50% of crops are destroyed by pests. And COVID-19, again, only exacerbated this problem because it contributed to labor shortages, which then led to disruptions in the food supply. And so we sent a team of Googlers who worked with Wadhwani AI to actually create an app that made it really easy for farmers to take a photo of their pest traps, and then an AI algorithm would actually evaluate and count the pests and identify and help guide the farmer around what pesticides they should use. Do you all have this video?
Tips for taking trap photos in order to get correct recommendations. Start by pressing the trapped live moths gently to kill them. We will not be able to analyze the crop condition if moths are crushed. Empty the moths on a clean white sheet of paper. All the trapped moths should be spread out on the sheet. Now open the app to take a photo of the sheet. If needed, you can use gallery. The white sheet should take up the entire camera screen, like this. Wait for the photo to be accepted by the app. In case it is not captured correctly, the app will ask you to retake the photo. Once the photo is accepted, discard the moths by burying them in the ground. Repeat these steps with each of your traps. Before you go, 3 things to remember. Don't crush the moths to kill them. Don't use a dirty sheet of white paper. Don't show anything except the white sheet with moths in the photo.
Great, and so as you saw, the fellows sort of built this app to help the farmers figure out what pesticides they should use. But really, again, it starts with the problem statement. And so they did a lot of user research to understand the farmers and figure out what their needs were. And they determined, for example, that they needed that type of instructional video to help them understand exactly how to trap the pests and how to count them. And there were really promising results from this test. So as you can see at the bottom, a significant increase in profit margin and a decrease in pesticide costs. So really promising results there. But again, I wanted to use this case study to really share more about how we do these engagements, how we do these collaborations between nonprofits and governments and Googlers, because the reality is doing pro bono work is hard, or maybe more accurately, doing pro bono work well is difficult. We've heard a few stories from nonprofits where maybe a technologist came in and built an incredible product, but then they left without a plan in place for how it was going to be maintained. And so that's something we've really tried to avoid and create structures to ensure it doesn't happen with our Google.org fellowship. And so how we actually go about doing that, we try to think about our pro bono engagement in a few different stages, as you can see here. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they give you sort of some sense of the steps that we take. And what I thought for the rest of the time, I could go through and share one of our high-level learnings from each of these to help folks if they're engaging in their own collaborations between businesses and nonprofits and governments. So the first stage is around selecting a project, and so this is really important in that there's no shortage of problems that we could work on, and if you're thinking about a project for yourself, similarly, there's really no shortage of work that could be done, but we find it's really important to focus on those where we think we can add differential value, and so we look at a number of different criteria. This is just a sample of them, but we look at things like the impact of the problem, but also, whether it's possible to actually achieve those results and a number of different things that you see here. But just to zero in on impact, we try to focus on projects that are not only going to provide an impact for the organization we're working with, but also for the sector at large. And so if we go back to that Wadhwani case study, it's clear that it will definitely help farmers in India, but it could also easily be adapted to help farmers elsewhere in the world who are dealing with different crops or different pests. And so we saw potential to not just help Wadhwani, but to really advance the way the sector deals with this problem. I won't go through them each in detail, but just to give you some sense. And then the next phase is scoping. So we find it's really helpful to engage in sort of divergent and then convergent thinking to really narrow in on what you want to focus on. So our fellowships provide anywhere from 5 to 15 Googlers who are working full-time for 6 months, which is a large influx of resources, but at the same time, they're eventually going to go back to their day jobs, and so it's still a limited amount of time, and we need to make sure that they can really accomplish their goals in that time and that they can build code that's sustainable and maintainable. And so we want to make sure we're narrowing the scope to ensure we're really keyed into those user needs, and also that we're enabling the fellows to create unit tests or do other things that lead to more maintainable code, for example. Next up is recruitment. So again, we find it's really helpful if you can zero in on projects that are at the intersection of your employees' skill sets and interests. And so Suresh, for example, was a fellow on our Wadhwani fellowship, and his grandfather was a farmer in India, and his dad grew up on a farm. And so he saw firsthand the sort of challenges that farmers were facing, and it made him really passionate about and dedicated to this cause of helping farmers. And he also had a lot of the skill sets that we needed, and so we often work in areas like AI for social good, or making the world's information accessible and useful, or projects that require a lot of user-centered design, or maybe mapping or things like that. So by really narrowing in on those projects where we think Google can add differential value, we've seen that the impact is truly exponential. Finally comes to executing on the work. So this is when the fellows are actually on the ground working alongside their nonprofit partners. And in this stage, there's been a ton of really interesting research, both externally and internally, on what makes an effective team. And the research has consistently shown that it's not actually about creating the best team. It's not actually about, hiring the best people. It's really about creating the best team. So the number one factor that correlates with team effectiveness is having psychological safety on the team. And these other factors that you see here were also quite important. But equally interesting is what you don't see on the screen. And so factors like the co-location of teammates or the seniority of the team actually didn't correlate with team effectiveness. And so we place a high premium on developing psychological safety within both the fellows themselves and with their nonprofit counterparts, because we find that when you really invest in the team, the results that they can have together are really amazing. So the final phase that I mentioned is offboarding. And so again, I mentioned a sort of common challenge that we see is sometimes folks don't think about offboarding until the entire engagement has ended. And in that, all too common scenario. Again, you're less likely to have a real impact in these collaborations because the project's likely going to fizzle out as soon as the collaboration has officially ended because the nonprofit or government can't take the work forward. And so we actually try to think about offboarding at every stage of the collaboration. You may have noticed that even the very first slide about this that was around our project criteria includes maintenance and sustainability as one of the requirements. And so before we even select a project, we make sure that we have a plan in place for how the work is going to be maintained after the fellows have rolled off. And so often this means we're pairing it with grant funding so that the organization can hire someone who can take on the work, or sometimes it means we're engaging in capacity building, where we're teaching someone in the org how to do ML or something like that, but really critical and something we think about even from the very start. And we also think about it at every step of the way after that. And so next up is scoping. And again, I mentioned during the presentation, we really narrow the scope to ensure the fellows are creating maintainable code so that the org can keep the project going after they roll off. When we get to recruitment, I don't think I mentioned this, but we make sure to recruit folks like site reliability engineers who can actually create dashboards that include monitoring and alerting to make it really easy to know if anything has gone wrong and to minimize the amount of time it takes between discovery of a problem and being able to fix it. And all of that helps with the ultimate long-term success of the project. Finally, we get into executing, and again, a number of different things here around offboarding, but for example, we think it's important to do a code freeze before the project has ended so that you can really test out and make sure nothing's going to break immediately, and let the org sort of practice maintaining it going forward. So those are just a few examples from each stage, but the high-level lesson here is just that you should take offboarding into account at every step of the process to ensure that your project's going to have lasting impact. So I think that is actually it for me, but thank you so much.